Well, last Wednesday night, we left off about halfway through our study, of King Joash. Joash, of course, one of the kings of Judah. He was the last surviving heir of David. He ascended to the throne at 7 years of age. And as long as his uncle, the priest Jehoiada, was alive, Joash was a good man. He stood for God's will because he sought the wise counsel of his uncle, who was a priest. Well, after the death of Jehoiada, Joash lost his main advisor, and rather than seek out wise counsel, he began to turn to the leaders of the people. And rather than take into consideration what would be best for the nation and for the people, he simply went along with what the leaders of the people said that the people wanted. And so he allowed idol worship to come back into the land of Judah. Well, we left off talking about the fact that during this time, God sent a number of prophets to Judah, trying to turn them back to the right way. One of those was the son of Jehoiada and Jehoshabeth, the aunt and uncle of King Joash. His name was Zechariah. Zechariah, he came and he began to prophesy, and the people didn't like what he had to say. And so the people, their solution was, well, we have to get rid of Zechariah. And rather than recognize that Zechariah was a good man doing the Lord's will, Joash went along with what the people wanted. And he allowed Zechariah to be put to death. And we talked about the fact that there was a repayment that was going to come upon the nation of Judah because of the shedding of Zechariah's innocent blood. And we talked about the fact that Jesus alluded to this in Matthew 23, 34 through 36, where he was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And he's talking about the fact that that was ultimately the repayment that came upon Judah because they had desired the death of an innocent man, a godly man. But then we come to the end of Joash's life. Joash, because of the bad decisions that he had made, God allowed Syria to come in and begin conquering land. And we find that the reason that this was allowed is because, as the text says, because Joash had allowed the people to return to idol worship. God was with them, was supporting them, so long as they were serving him. But when they turned their backs on God and went back to idol worship, God allowed this neighboring country to come in and begin conquering their land and begin oppressing the people. Well, they came in and they collected many spoils from the cities of Judah, and they carried those things back to Syria. And there they were given to the king of Syria. And one of the things that I find very interesting is Syria at this time had an army that was much smaller than the army of Judah. Judah should have handily been victorious over the Syrians. But we find that God was not with them. And so the Syrians came in with a much smaller army. And 2 Chronicles 24:24 says that the Lord delivered Judah into their hands because they had forsaken the Lord God of their fathers. But in this battle against Syria, Joash was wounded. His wounds were not mortal, but we find that while he was recuperating, some of his own servants turned against him. He would not succumb to the injuries that were afflicted upon him in battle. But some of his own servants conspired against him, the text says, because of the blood of the sons of Jehoiada the priest. Because he had authorized the death of Zechariah. His servants turned against him, and we find that King Joash was killed while lying in his bed. His servants came in, and really the image that we see is he's lying in his bed trying to recuperate from the injuries that he had in battle. He was in pretty much a helpless state, and these servants come in and they take his life. Joash, he was buried in Jerusalem, but because of this action he had taken against Zechariah, he was not buried along with the kings. So what are a couple of applications that we see from the life of Joash? Well, first and foremost, we see from this that you need to beware of leaders who bow to popular demand rather than stand for the truth. So long as Joash had Jehoiada, he had wise counsel. He served God. But when Jehoiada died, he didn't know where to turn. His advisor, his father figure, the man who had raised him from a newborn, was gone. Joash started listening to the leaders of the people and allowed them to essentially do whatever they wanted to do, including bring back the idolatry that Jehoiada had driven out of the land and to kill Jehoiada's own son. But something that we need to understand is that anyone who is going through this life with the main concern of being attentive to what people want, folks, that kind of individual is going to find themselves being blown around by every wind of doctrine, by every whim that comes along, by every new fad, by every new idea. James 1, 6 through 8 talks about them being tossed like a ship on the sea, because they don't have that foundation.
They're really a dangerous person.
They are. They are. Because ultimately what they are doing, they are trying to gain the acceptance of the people by giving the people what they want, not necessarily what they need. But also another lesson. And folks, this is one that we really saw the Jews dealing with this a lot. You do see this with some individuals today. And really it's a question. Folks, do we care more about the house or do we care about what happens in the house? Let that sink in for just a minute. Do we care more about the house or do we care more about what happens in the house? Joash led the way in rebuilding and restoring the temple back to its former glory, but he could not care less about what happened in the temple. He wanted that structure back to its opulence. He wanted that source of pride. He wanted people to be able to look at him and say, well, Joash is the one that has restored this. But he didn't care anything about the religious practices that were going on. All he cared about was the building. He allowed the people, as the text says, to leave the house of the Lord God of their fathers to worship idols. Well, similar to Joash, you think about the scribes and the Pharisees that we read about in the New Testament and the great pride that they had in that temple complex that was there. They cared more about the building itself than the validity of the practices and the rituals that were actually going on in that place. And so we find Jesus on a number of occasions calling them out for this. But ultimately we find in Acts 7 and verse 48, Stephen has been drug out of the temple essentially. And the reason why that he has drawn the ire of the people is because he told them that the Most High does not dwell in temples made with hands. This was the house of God he was talking about. To the Jews, that was the dwelling place of God. But that old covenant had been fulfilled. That was nothing more than a building. And when he made that statement, the people didn't want to hear it. And just as their ancestors did to Zechariah, they put Stephen to death. He died. Folks, the most important thing to us should be the faithfulness of our worship. The faithfulness of the service that we offer to God. And when we allow anything to take that position of prominence where our faithfulness resides, then we're setting ourselves up for danger. We've put ourselves in a position where we're no longer in God's favor. That's what happened with Joash and the people of his day.